Welcome back to this latest episode of Japan's Top Business Interviews. I'm your host, Dr. Greg Story, the president of Dale Carnegie Training Tokyo, Japan. And my special guest today is Dan Kerrigan, who is the CEO of Interactive Brokers here in Japan. Dan, welcome.
Greg, it's a pleasure to see you.
Dan, you've had a long and varied career in Asia and also Japan. So just a brief recap on how is it you're running Interactive Brokers here in Tokyo?
Right, I can start with my involvement in Japan, which I say is serendipitous. So I grew up in the U.S., in the Midwest, just a small town about an hour outside of Chicago. There's not a lot of Japanese influence there. I didn't study Japanese at school. Went to school locally, and like a lot of people, went to New York to try to make my fortune. I faffed around a bit at an ad agency for about a year, and I had enough friends that worked on Wall Street that said, look, mate, you really need a career change. So got an interview with a Japanese firm at the time in the late 80s called Yamaichi Securities.
Was that by accident, by choice? Was it by someone you knew as a
It was. I knew a lot of people that were working on Wall Street at the time, and I knew after seeing what they did that there was a spot for me. But it was just through a friend that said, look, I've got a headhunter, go see this guy. Had a great interview with him. He called me the next day, and he said, look, I've got the perfect job for you. Yeah. The only drawback is they want you to go to Japan. Oh. So I went to the New York Public Library. There was something pre-Google called microfiche.
I remember microfiche.
So I did some research on the company, got the job, and I was going back and forth for a few years between Tokyo and New York. Really liked it here, decided to come over, learn the language, learn about the economy. So I finagled my way into a job starting in 1990, right at the start of the blowing up the bubble. It was fine. Had a very good run.
Yamaichi hadn't imploded by that time, though.
No, they didn't go under until 1997. So I left. I did that for 2 years, came over here in 1990 with NatWest Bank, did that, was running their sales, worked at Credit Suisse for a couple of years, and then I had a 10-year run with SG Warburg, which got acquired by Swiss Bank, which then merged with UBS. So I was with the same group of guys there for 10 years, which was fantastic. 2005, one of my clients said, look, he was running an asset management company, and he said, I'm up to $1 billion. I really need somebody to go run the trading and the marketing. The job was in Honolulu. Certain things you only need to be asked once. So I was the CEO of an asset management company based in Hawaii, and then came back to run cities trading from 2009 to 2015. And then last 5 years or so, I've been down in Hong Kong. And just moved back here with Interactive Brokers in April of this year.
So in that long career span of working in Japan, what point did you actually become the leader of a team responsible for that group?
It was my first job with NatWest here.
That was NatWest. So
right.
How big was the team at that time?
I was in charge of equities by the time I left, and it was about 30 people. It wasn't a big team.
Right, no, it was big enough.
Yeah.
So I guess and it was mainly Japanese or mixed?
No, it was all the staff.
Yeah.
There was a mixture of people.
So what were some of the things that you noticed that, you're coming out of an American environment, educated in America, and then you've worked on Wall Street, you come to Japan, you're in a Gaishikei company, global multinational company, but it's in Japan.
Right.
The team are Japanese. What were some of the challenges you came across in terms of leading a Japanese team?
I think any leader needs empathy. I think any good salesman needs empathy. You need to put yourself in the other person's shoes and understand what's important to them. What are their buttons? Do they need a carrot? Do they need a stick? Who responds to each? And there was a story in one of my first jobs where it was getting to performance review season and bonus season, and one of my staff came to me and said, look, you don't need to give me a bonus. Just give me a title. Put something on my business card, put me in charge of a business, or just give me the title. And that was much more important to him than getting paid or promoted.
Wasn't he driven by the money like everyone else?
Again, different mentality, different culture. Certainly people in the West just want to get paid and promoted, and everything else is an afterthought.
So I guess from your point of view, when someone asks you for, hey, I don't want any money, I just want a title, you're like, well, that's an easy decision. Or was it an easy
Yes
decision?
and no, because there's still a protocol that's involved in giving somebody responsibility. There's no point in when you have a title, again, you're being asked for how to have more responsibility.
Was he asking for more responsibility? Or
he just wanted the title.
Right?
Yeah, he just wanted the title.
And why was that?
again, sometimes it's form over function in some ways. Sometimes people are more about the image and the perception than the reality. So, but
Did he believe, for example, that that title would give him an edge in business with clients? That would give him more credibility?
That was part of it. His view was when I go in to see a client, they study your meishi, as you know, your business card, and the title is very important. As we say, the katagaki, right?
So he saw that as a step to getting more business?
He did, but it was more for his own ego, I think.
Really?
So you had to be aware of that.
Okay, that's interesting.
And then you need to have the discussion further about what's the real backstory with him. So that was just one interesting sort of episode.
Other things sort of pop up that you thought, well, that's a bit unusual.
If you're a manager as well, you need to be aware of the expectations that are being put upon you. So again, in my first job, I was doing a reasonable amount of business. I was kind of pleased with myself. One morning I look up and the CFO of the company is standing over my desk with a printout of my revenues and my expenses. Yeah, fresh off the daisy wheel printer. That's how long ago it was. I said, Daniel-san, your expenses. I thought, oh, great, here we go. He said, your expenses are too low. Excuse me? You're expected to take your clients out. Your expenses should be 5% of your gross revenues. You'll do more business if you take your clients out. So I was letting the team down. Now, this was a bygone era, clearly, but in that expense could be taken out of pre-tax income back then, so it doesn't exist anymore. But the perception was, yes, you have to take the clients out and you have to just show the receipts that you've been doing things apart from your day-to-day job. That was a very important part of the culture.
And, I mean, you were obviously getting results. You obviously weren't taking enough people out to dinner, Dan. You were letting the team down.
That was letting the team down. He thought I could do more. No, he could do more. He said, you'll do more business if you take your clients out. And I thought he was winding me up at first, but no, he was serious. But again, problems that don't exist.
They'd come across a pattern in that business. The more entertaining went on with clients, the more revenues came.
Absolutely.
Regardless of sales ability, consultative sales ability, analysis of needs ability, just that sheer human touch had an actual calculable difference.
It was a key performance indicator at the time.
Wow, that's intriguing, yeah. That would be commonly called the good old days.
Those are the good old days. These are still the good old days.
Yeah.
To quote Carly Simon.
Being on the receiving end of that and thinking it was my charm, you know, really popular.
I think it was your Amex.
Yeah, really. You know, now looking back, I realize it wasn't me at all. The excuse.
Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. What other things came up?
Again, you had to go out with the clients, not the clients, but the colleagues as well. That was an expectation. I think nearly everyone you've interviewed has talked about the tatamae and hone
The superficial reality and the
versus
actual
the actual. And people say, well, this is not it's a consensus society here. That's not actually true. It's a non-confrontational society. So
there's a split between non-confrontational and consensus there.
You get the story, you get consensus after you get everything fleshed out, all of the objections voiced, and people do want to have their voices heard. And your prior guests have talked about nomication, the sort of, the Romans used to call it in vino veritas, right? But the level of communication that you only get when you're out socially with somebody. And it's just interesting. So I say it's a non-confrontational society. So it's a bit different in that regard. People still have their opinions, but you need to spend time to find out what their real concerns are, because they probably won't tell you during normal business hours. Because
you're their boss, they're working for you, why wouldn't they tell you?
Again, they think that they're being disruptive during the day when you should be doing business, and it's a certain level of communication that only comes out after hours. So the cliche is there's no backstabbing in the Wall Street firms. They will throw battle axes at you in full view of everybody on the trading floor. Here you get these titanic sort of political matches, but it's all sort of kabuki drama.
It's subterranean.
It is, and you really need to figure out where the fault lines are. You need to do some digging, and it usually comes outside of the office.
Right. And is that a function of the fact that you're a foreigner? or is it a function of this is just the boss employee?
Yeah, I've been a foreigner for most of my career, so I don't really have another perspective on
when
this.
you observed or you talked to your Japanese colleagues, I mean, are they doing the same thing for the same reasons, or is this something as a foreigner you need to do to actually get that level of communication going?
I think it's something that you have to come out and to spend the extra effort to get. You wouldn't necessarily get that because it has to be faced as a foreigner. It has to be face to face. And again, they don't want to put anything in writing either, which is not a bad thing.
Well, nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. So what other things pop up?
Well, I think the interesting thing is a couple of things. Your strategy really comes down to where your company is in the competitive landscape. I think it's interesting. Most people in the industry know who Michael Porter is and his 5 forces for how you evaluate a company. I think he's done some very interesting work that is lesser known somewhat about the competitiveness of nations. And his points are you really don't want to start a watch company in Switzerland. You probably don't want to start a private bank in Switzerland either. It's not advisable to start a chocolates company in Belgium in that they've got very fierce competition. And to that regard, financial services is a very competitive industry in the United States. But what was interesting, my very first time over here, a bunch of us were out after drinks or after work, as you do. And there was a somewhat cloistered colleague of ours, a Japanese woman who I don't think had ventured much outside of Tokyo, let alone Japan. And she innocently inquired during the evening, do we have McDonald's in America? You can imagine her astonishment when it was 1988.
Wow. Okay.
So you can imagine her astonishment when it was brought to her attention, yes, indeed, we did have McDonald's in America, and in fact, it's an American company. It was an eye-opener to me because growing up, as I did, you were told that this was a closed economy. It mostly had to do with the steel industry and the automobile industry. But you look around here, one of the charming foibles, as you know, here is you've got sort of one vending machine for every 20 people. Half of them seem to be Coca-Cola. And at one stage, Coke was getting 20% of their global profits from here. You look around, Mercedes, BMW do very well here, as does Tesla more recently. And you've got all of the European luxury brands, so littering the streets of Ginza and Omotesando.
Not too many American luxury brands.
There aren't. No, but at the same time, it brings us to financial services, and the American firms do very well here, which goes to show, to Michael Porter's point, if you're competitive in your home market, you have a good shot of doing well here.
It's interesting on that point. I don't know if you and I are at Jesper Cole's talk at the American Chamber recently, and I think in that talk, or at least it wasn't that talk, it was in the previous talk, he often puts up the competitiveness slide for Japan. He talks about, in America, the 2 or 3 companies will have a massive market share dominance in a particular vertical. When he shows the Japanese equivalent, it's minuscule. It's like it's so split between companies. It's hard to get that dominant share. So it seems, in his observation, that Japan is really, really, really competitive around market share portions compared to, say, America, where some of the dominant players do have a big chunk of the market. So I wonder how that fits into your idea about the competitiveness of American firms succeeding here.
I can see, that's a really good point. What that means is you have to choose your clients very carefully. Because a lot of times you will be competing with clients who are using a different metric. They're using market share instead of profitability. And in our approach to the domestic asset managers, for example, in my industry, most people come out and say, oh, we want to be number 1 with these clients. With the domestic guys, no, you don't want to be. And the reason is it's more lucrative. The sweet spot might be the top of the second tier among their brokers, for example. And we had done some analysis. If we wanted to be number 1 with some of these domestic asset managers, we would be spending $2 in resource for the marginal additional $1 of revenue. So again, we didn't want to get in and go head to head with some of the domestic brokers so we can have the bragging rights.
Yeah.
So know what your competitors are up to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah. So, in the time that you were running teams here over the years, you've been here in different companies, and companies have merged, and it's changed, etc. But I guess the continuity is you are here, you're leading. When you think about getting your teams engaged, getting your teams behind the effort, like you're the leader, you're saying, right, this is where we're going to go, and that's great. It's like that American quote, the what's the guy's name, the American baseball catcher who was always mangled in his languages.
Yogi Berra?
Yeah, exactly. And he was saying that leading is easy. It's getting people to follow you. That's the tricky part, right? And it's always the tricky part, right? So what have you found you've discovered worked well for you to get a team to follow you and be engaged in the task at hand?
I think it's very important to recognize and articulate what the mega trends are. I was first here in my full-time job. I looked out the window and there was a queue of people outside of Tayo Kobe Bank. Again, how long ago that was.
Tayo Kobe Bank, you've got to have a good memory for
now,
Tayo Kobe Bank.
Well, I can't forget this one. It's never a good scene to look out the window and have people queued up outside of a bank. We all remember the film It's a Wonderful Life, when the good citizens of Bedford Falls are trying to take their money out of the Building and Loan Society. These people were queued up so they could put their money in. Certificates of deposit at the time were trading at yielding 8%. And it was a sign that they were taking all their money out of the Nikkei. And so that was a clear sign of a break. And it was the bursting of the bubble. And we had to clearly think about what are the business opportunities. So the bursting of the bubble meant that you needed to have an investment banking business here, because all of the banks had to recapitalize their balance sheets. There was a lot of privatization business. The telecoms, the NTT was selling tranches of shares from the government. Docomo had done its IPO, and there were more tranches coming there. There was the privatization of the railroads, JR East, West, Central. And there was also an unwinding of the cross-held shares. This is, again, one of the other narratives that we used to get before we moved here about how Japanese companies could take a long-term view because they held shares in each other. Now, suddenly, when the market was reversing, they realized this wasn't a good thing. There's something about 45% or so of the market cap of the Nikkei was made up of basically treasury shares, cross-held shares. So those firms that had equity capital markets teams could do quite well on that. And there's been a large rise in a movement away from high-touch trading to electronic trading. So
what's high-touch?
High-touch is when you're on the phone. So a long time ago, remember there used to be people on the floor of the Tokyo Stock Exchange giving the hand signals, and you would call down and get the Baikai, the bid-ask, and then relay that. That's all been automated. And there are a lot of other things that still can be automated. And I always say, do an audit of your day-to-day activities. Anything that you're doing that can be automated, push to have it automated, because it will be, whether you do it or not, and the margins on that are asymptotically going to zero. And the things that require face-to-face contact, throw people at. One, because that's how the function works, but two, the margins in those activities are largely going to be less resistant to compression.
Okay. So we were talking about getting engagement from your team. So what other things did you find work well? You talked about having strategic view of where the markets are moving. That's one aspect of it. What else? And
then clearly articulate within that vision, what is everybody's role? And you've played sports, like all Aussies, right? What is your role? Are you, using an American football analogy, are you on the offensive line? Are you the quarterback? Are you a running back? Are you a receiver? But everybody's got a role to play. And people do get very engaged when they understand just how important their role is, and then they get recognition for it. But articulating what is the expectations are, I think, is the key to getting engagement.
Recognition look like? Because in a lot of cases,
if you can just give somebody a title and get away with it, then why not, right?
Yeah, well, in a lot of cases, you're doing your job. You're getting paid. You're doing your job. There's no recognition, particularly. That's the expectation is work hard, make money, do your job. That's where it stops. But what you're talking about is something beyond that, of actually recognising people doing their job. So at what point, and I'm just wondering in your background, and I've never, not worked on Wall Street, I've no idea, but I imagine there's not a lot of praise hanging around there. There's probably a lot of orders and a lot of expectation, but probably not a lot of recognition. Yet somehow you're here and you're giving recognition to your team. So where did that idea come from, and when did you discover this worked?
Fairly early on in my career. Again, most Wall Street bosses will say, I'm not going to thank you for doing your job. And at the same time, you don't want to have everyone think that they're a trade error away from being fired as well. I think in this culture, you don't want to cost it anybody. But at the same time, you just have to pay attention, let people know that their efforts are being recognized and they're important. And if you can measure it, so much the better.
How do you, what things did you do to recognize?
Again, we looked at the number of, say, trade delays that we had, failed trades. So we wanted to, most of the back office people only get recognized when there's an error or when there's a delay. But if you can put in other key performance indicators, then normally that will resonate with people. Most people in this industry are competitive and they like having things measured.
Even back office people?
Even back office people. You'd be surprised.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I thought back office people were trying to avoid all that competition.
Some of them do, but
snooker down the back there and getting stuck into doing some.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a different personality type that you might find from one of the traders. But
yeah,
yes.
Exactly. Well, I had that when I was running the National Australia Bank. It was the first time for me to lead back office people because I'm always used to leading sales people. It was such a culture shock for me. I was like, wow, it's quite difficult to lead these people. I could never get on their wavelength. I found it hard anyway.
Right.
So what other things did you do to engage people?
That's the main thing. Just pay attention, make sure they can trust you.
Give them some strategic direction.
Yeah.
Pay attention to what they're doing.
Guys, you'd be surprised at how few people come in and say good morning to people who are in positions of leadership. I just think that's a par for the course. It's something you should do. So yes, I make a victory lap around the office.
This is a culture of a higher zone us, like
yes.
ISATS is part of the culture here, so I'm wondering why that's not happening as part of the culture. I would have expected it part of the culture without being any additional requirement. Are you talking about the foreign bosses not saying good morning?
No, it's some of the locals and places where I've worked, but I think it's an easy win every morning. It's a good way to start your morning. I try to do it most days.
Yeah, no, that's a good idea. If you want to be successful as a leader, do the Leadership Training for Managers course. All companies need people who can both manage and lead. Leading people screams out for real skills in communication, dealing with all different types of people, being excellent at innovation, planning, delegation, handling mistakes, doing performance reviews really well, and inspiring and motivating the team. Do the Leadership Training for Managers course now in either Japanese or English. If we think that we've got a reasonably engaged team, that's, I think anyway, the basis for getting people to think about their work. And some companies have R&D teams, they're sort of scientists, they're highly analytical, they're really cutting edge of that type of thing.
Right.
What I'm talking about for creativity, innovation, just people who work in the business, not necessarily in those R&D sections. So in terms of getting creativity, innovation from people, what have you found has worked well for you?
I think it's very important to have an environment where people are not going to be punished for failure. And I always use the example of, if you've seen Tom Wolfe's The Right Stuff or read the book, the first number of NASA launches all failed, but it was all part of the learning process. So whereas in some cultures here, failure is final and people are reticent to try new things. Here, you've got to let people know and say it's okay if it doesn't work right away. It's an iterative process, and those are, as I said, steps along the way, and eventually we'll get there and win. So I'm being...
Seeing that, isn't it? Because you talk about an iterative process, and that's really Kaizen, isn't it? Because Kaizen is not necessarily the big leaps from Walkman to iPod. It's sort of, a better Walkman type of thing. So that Japanese artisan, craftsman, woman culture is sort of there for iterative improvement.
Mm.
But in terms of innovation, how do you actually get people to go beyond iterative to something a bit more major?
I look back at the way we had conducted business 10 years ago, 15 years ago, even 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It's embarrassing.
Is it
As I said,
embarrassing?
well,
What
no,
was embarrassing?
you go back, you can pull up clips
Mhm.
of getting a Baikai, for example, on the Tokyo Stock Exchange.
Mhm.
Or you pull up an old computer system and
Mhm.
say, this is what we used to use.
Mhm.
And now how we do things looks very different, and
Mhm.
to the point where you look back and you think, I can't believe we used to do that. I can't believe we had to call down and get a
Floppy disks.
exactly, or yeah, cassette
I still
play,
got it, though, so-
cassette players, things like this,
Yeah.
daisy wheel printers, as I
Yeah.
said. And I say, if we're doing our job correctly, we're going to look back 10 years from now and what we're doing today and be embarrassed the way we're doing things now. There are a lot of innovations and
Mhm.
efficiencies that we can still wring out of the system.
Mhm.
What are we doing? And look at, again, audit
That is
how you're spending your time.
technology-driven, though, right?
It's
So,
all technology driven, yes.
Again, probably none of us are going to be developing any particular new technology, but we're users of
Doesn't mean we can't use it, absolutely.
Yeah, we use the technology and we have corporate systems.
Mm.
So what about how do you encourage people to think about, things like workflow,
Mm.
things like what we should start doing, stop doing, reduce what we're doing, expand what we're doing, all those sorts of, frames of reference to get some more innovation from the business.
Part of it's an art.
Mm-hmm.
So some people are early adopters
Mm-hmm.
of new processes. Others cling. And the thing is, just stop renewing the subscription from the old way of doing things. That usually works
Mm-hmm.
pretty well. If they're using an old system or they're using
Mm-hmm.
an old vendor that we want to get off of, just cut off the subscription. Usually seems to work in my experience.
Okay, cancel all the old subscriptions.
Exactly.
Make them start again.
Exactly. Or just adopt the new one.
Mm. So, part of that engagement thing is based around trust.
Mm.
And you talked before about making mistakes
Mm.
and how mistakes are handled, and we
Mhm.
talked a bit about the iterative process of improvement here.
Right.
And one of the things about not wanting to make a mistake is your belief that the results of that are going to be horrendous for you. And so the best way not to make a mistake is to do nothing,
Mm.
because you don't trust that your mistake is going to be recognised as a learning process. And the Japanese concept of things, you're going to get punished. So don't make mistakes. It's like no defect culture. And we often talk about CFOs in Western companies will look at some process and say, if we have a 0 defect rate, we'll make this much money. If we have a 0.5 defect rate, we'll make this much money. So we'll go for the 0.5 and we'll make more money and we'll deal with all the rework and replacements and whatever. Whereas in Japan, that'd be unacceptable. Like, no, it's got to be 0. So it's very hard when the culture is pushing people towards have this sort of idea of no defects, no mistakes, to help them understand that, look, learning process is messy, innovation process is messy, yes, there will be mistakes, and this trust that they can have that freedom to make a mistake and know that it's not career ending. So how did you go about sort of gelling those two ideas together of, we see mistakes as part of the process of learning.
Mm.
We don't expect it to happen every time for the
Right.
same mistake, of course, but we see that, and we're not going to crush you, we're not going to destroy you for making one mistake, which, I think for a lot of Japanese, they've got that fear, so they're really holding themselves back and working within a very small comfort zone, so they don't want to step out of that and take a risk. So how did you work that?
A couple things. The worst thing you can have on your performance review is so-and-so son fails to challenge the status quo.
Now, hang on a minute, this is in terms of your company's performance review you're talking, or are you just talking
Yes.
generally?
That's always been my case for all the staff.
Right.
Failure to challenge the status quo is something that I see as a black mark. And I
Right.
give them the heads up on that.
Right.
But if
That's
somebody's...
quite antithetical to how things are done here. Like here, challenging the status quo should be a black mark. Doing what everyone else is doing, big.
If not, we'd
Okay.
still have guys on the floor of the Tokyo Stock Exchange. So
Mm.
it goes back to my earlier point about wanting to automate what we can. Now, tactically, how do we achieve that? The concept of face is something that's talked about a lot here, and it's true. Like most cliches, they're grounded in truth. It's still important to criticize privately and praise publicly. And if there is a mistake, I am always the guy trying to be the human shield and take responsibility for the error, so it can deflect any sort of grief that the person who actually did it might get at this point, but it also ensures that that person is still going to want to soldier on and try to innovate as well.
Sure
and I've got the boss's freedom in order to do that.
I'm sure you've seen, in the Japanese context, it's actually the opposite. It's actually criticizing people publicly, and yelling at people.
I find that doesn't work.
Screaming at people, right? So
not in this culture.
Well, I'm just talking about in general in business terms, right? Because when we're teaching leadership training for Japanese corporates and the staff, and we talk about how to handle mistakes, and often the Japanese team will talk about, oh yeah, when my boss threw an ashtray in my head or yelled at me in front of everyone, I made a mistake and just, got really stuck into me publicly, right? So it's always surprising to me, given how sort of harmonious Japanese culture is, that actually went on. And I always, as you have expressed, it just seems like a crazy way of running anything, but this is what has happened here. And I'm probably sure maybe in some of the companies you've been working in, you've seen this amongst the Japanese with the Japanese, I've certainly seen it. Quite surprising. So I never quite understood that. It sort of always seemed to be jarring with the sort of harmonious nature of the culture. But it's certainly, I can imagine, if you're getting criticised, you're going to shrink. You're going to really shrivel up and shrink and be scared of your own shadow. And you're never going to be, challenging the status quo, as you mentioned before. So these two things are quite tightly linked, aren't they?
From my experience, yes, indeed.
So what are the things you found that build trust between you and the team? What are the things?
Well, I think it's important to be in a position perhaps where you can screw somebody over and you don't do it.
What would be a case where you screw somebody
Well,
over?
in case people are in this industry, perhaps running afoul of other managers or other people that they don't like, and you go to bat for them and you make sure that they're looked after at the end of the year, things like that. So, but that takes time.
So you're intervening to,
if needed.
save face, keep someone in the team, that sort of thing. What other things come up?
Yeah, so you have to know what really is going on with people. I'm not saying they delve into their personal lives, but as we go through life at certain times, you have to know, are their parents getting to a certain age and they need to spend more time to look after them, or do they have a sick child? I think just being aware of that and cutting them a little bit of slack, or just understanding what's happening, I think is a very important part of being a good boss.
Japanese are not so outspoken about
They're
this.
not going to talk about their personal lives, but doesn't mean you should still know about it if you have your ear to the ground. They won't come to you. They're not going to bare their soul, certainly. You wouldn't want that, but just be cognizant of it. And I think that goes a tremendous way in terms of gaining trust. And it's something that you may not be as common in a Japanese firm.
Well, it's always shocking to me, and this is within the Japanese group themselves, that someone's getting married, for example. They keep that an absolute rock solid secret until like the week before they're getting married or something, and suddenly they announce, I'm getting married, And I guess part of that is so that there's no problem if the marriage doesn't proceed or it's all over or something. There's no face lost. So that sort of keep the face lost down to a minimum by keeping a big secret. So as the boss, you suddenly realise, oh, I had no idea, or someone's had a baby or something, And again, same thing, or you might, as you say, ear to the ground, you hear from somebody else that, oh, so-and-so's had a baby. You have no idea they had a baby, I'm always shocked when that happens, like, don't I know, I'm the boss, I'm supposed to know what's going on around here. Got no clue what's going on. It's like keep it within the cone of silence, type of thing. So it's always a bit frustrating in Japan to actually have that ability to access and know what's going on.
Yeah, yes and no. I had to give speeches at Japanese weddings of people on my team that got married, and I didn't quite. I think if you're really the president, you give away the bride in some ways. I don't know. I don't know if that goes on anymore. I haven't done that, but I've given speeches at Japanese weddings in Japanese. Yeah, it's a nice touch.
Yeah, it is. It is. It is. But there is that little bit of a, I don't know, a reticence maybe to share too much with the boss. They keep.
Go back to the Zen mentality of you're completely focused on your work and your personal life is an afterthought, and I'm not sure if that still quite goes on as much as it did.
Well, I don't know about you. I am always encouraging my team to take their leave. Like I get a report on leave and I see, geez, it's about 20 days, 30 days leave, right? And I introduced an extra 5 days of company-supported leave for illness, rather separate to their recreational leave. Right? I actually brought that into the company because I thought that people weren't taking their recreational leave because I was sort of worried about using their leave for illness. So I said, well, we'll separate those two things out. It hasn't changed anything. Maybe they are taking that leave too, but they're still not wading through their recreational leave. And one of my team, she just came back from Okinawa. She had the wedding. I guess her husband must be from Okinawa. Had the wedding in Okinawa, and on her leave application, she wanted from like Monday to Thursday. And I said to her, like Monday to Thursday, why don't you take Friday off? Why are you coming back on a Thursday? It's work on a Friday. Oh, my husband, he has to come back to work. Right, hello,
Right.
But this is I understand this is how things work here, but it's always a bit, as an Australian anyway, where we take all our leave,
Right.
You don't let any leave go unused. It's always a bit shocking to have to actually encourage people to take time off and encourage people, to have a life outside of work. Yeah, I find that balance isn't quite right.
Again, going back to being the boss, you've got to understand what are their hobbies, what gets them going, what do they like to do in their free time.
Culture, you've had experience of a number of different types of culture in different organisations, different countries as well, and every organisation has a sort of a centralised culture at the headquarters, and then the further away you get away from that, you get variations of that, and also you'll get local cultures, and then you'll get, even in an office in a local culture, you'll get like a sectional culture or a group culture, one particular part of the company. So what have you found works well in terms of building that culture within the organisation? I'm not saying have a culture that's against what the central culture is trying to achieve. It's always going to be under that umbrella. If you want a culture against that, you've got a whole set of issues there, right there.
Right.
But under that umbrella framework, to then have a localised culture that reflects Japan, reflects the workforce.
Right.
What things you found work well to build that local culture?
It's tough to do from a top-down approach in some ways. And I'm just thinking back to my team at Citi, about 30 people, and had Koreans, I had a Greek guy. I mean, there was people from all over Asia. And the Korean guys, again, like to work hard, play hard. Some of the local guys who'd come up from the floor just knew how to get things done. So again, even going back to my time at UBS, we didn't have a Swiss boss the entire time I was there. All of what we had done was local.
Did you not have?
We didn't have a Swiss boss the whole time.
Boss.
I worked for, as I said, I worked for all 3 Swiss banks at one point. Never had a Swiss boss.
Right.
So it was always local wherever we were. And as I said, I think the best thing to do, put in a work hard, play hard mentality for one. Understand and read as much as you can, but also look out for each other. And I actually think...
When you say read as much as you can, you talk about reading people,
read people, but also know what's going on in the market. Don't just do your job.
Right.
Don't come in, if you're an execution trader, for example, don't just come in and do your job. Understand what's happening with the markets here. But also, in some ways, it is a reflection of the boss. There's the German term that the fish always starts to stink from the head. Right,
Is
so
that a German term?
it is,
I
yeah.
thought that was a Japanese saying.
I was told it was German,
Who knows? Anyway.
but yeah. So you can
Around, it's common.
As the head, you can set your own terms.
Right.
But the most important thing, I think, is just show respect, show involvement, and actually, the best leaders that I've seen are emotionally involved in what they're doing, and they have a certain level of understanding of the business, of the team, that can somewhat contradictorily allow them to be clinical in terms of making decisions for how the team should be run, what direction we should take. If somebody's underachieving, what should we do? Is it somebody that needs just a little bit more training? Or, again, I tell the story of somebody on my team years ago who was a super smart young man, perfect Japanese, mother was English, and after about 3 months or so, I pulled him into a conference room and I said, do you really like doing what you're doing? Do you roll out of bed in the morning wondering what the Dow Jones did, or where the treasuries are trading, or what dollar yen is? And he looked at me, he said, yeah, you're really right. And I said, look, you're really too smart to be doing what you're doing here, because it doesn't really align with what your interests are. And he went off and got a graduate degree in environmental science and is doing very well for one of the companies here. So just sort of taking the time to look at people, figure out what's best for them. And at the same time, I looked at some of my staff and I would say, okay, in 3 years, this person's going to be off running this business, or this person's going to have this skill. And I think it's almost like being a parent in some ways. You really do want to make sure your staff continue to develop and not do the same job.
Do you use tools like, for example, the vision, mission, values of the company as a driver of culture build, or you don't worry about it?
Not that I worry about it. If it's useful, I'll use it. But
we've... Here at Interactive, like, for example, do you have a vision, mission, values that's sort of centerpiece of what you do, or no?
We have a very strong culture here, and it is very much driven on innovation. And as I said, anything that can be automated will be. And it's very interesting here, having come from some of the more traditional integrated investment banks, to come here and work for a financial services firm that's actually a technology company, if I had. And this is superb. In talking about mega trends, there's a tremendous amount of household assets here that are going to be going through an intergenerational change. And if you look at some of the brick and mortar brokers, where people will go in and have a cup of coffee with their financial advisor and do a few trades, buy a few products here and there, their children are going to inherit those assets. But it won't be, very likely, won't be going to a brick and mortar firm.
Be online.
So I think I'm very excited to be working here.
Position in the right place.
Yes.
So if you're going to give some advice to someone who's going to be sent to Japan to run the operation, they don't know Japanese language, they don't know Japanese culture, but they've been told, okay, Greg, start packing up. You're going to Tokyo or Osaka or wherever. You're going to run the operation in Japan. What would be some advice you'd give that person?
I would say certainly you're being sent out here for a purpose, for business. You would do well to look at it also as an adventure. And the biggest mistake you could probably make is complain about the way things work, or the way you think they should work.
When you get here.
Absolutely. That's a recipe for failure. Understand what you need to do, what steps you need to take. There's some very prescriptive ways of going about things and being successful here. And if you figure out what that prescription is, what steps you need to take, you have a chance.
Yeah, what else do you need to do?
No, that's the main thing. But as I said, figure out where you are, what are the trends. The other thing is, as a foreign firm in Japan, I think you do have a niche of competitive advantage in terms of attracting staff. So diversity is one of those magic words that, what I call a Rorschach term, that people can say it means whatever they want it to mean, like out of Alice in Wonderland. And there's some paradoxes involved with that. So I was at an offsite years ago, and we brought in our diversity guy to speak about how this was in our best interests. And one of our more recalcitrant proprietary traders put his hand up and said, "Hey, so does this mean we got to hire stupid, lazy people to make up for the smart, hardworking people in this room?" you can imagine he's off doing something else right now. But yeah, if you do reductio ad absurdum with the term diversity, that's kind of what you can get to. The way we approach it here is similar to the president of the university I went to approached it. So I went to school in the Midwest. There was a brilliant guy that was the president named Father Theodore Hesburgh, who, in addition to running the school, was a pioneer in the civil rights movement and the university for years.
Which university is it?
Notre Dame.
Notre Dame.
And for years it was this somewhat parochial Midwestern men's college. He made the push to make it go co-ed. And when he was asked about his decision, he said it's quite simple. You cannot have a world-class organization or university if you're systematically excluding half of the population. And he was dead right. And the school's gone on to become what I think is the leading Catholic research university in the world. We have students from all over the place. I mentored a young man who's a student there now, who's from Australia, whose father I'd worked with. So it's becoming a lot more world-class. It's already world-class, but we're getting students from all over the world now, both men and women. And that's how we approach diversity. If you cast your net as widely as you can, you by definition will end up with people both diverse in terms of the way they look at the world, the way they operate, and their backgrounds. I think that's probably the best way to back into it that way, rather than the danger is you devolve into quotas or tokenism from there. But that's how we approach it. So my point is, Japan, from the surface, is this monolithic culture. People from Tokyo always joke they need a passport to go to Osaka. Very different people, as you know.
I worked there for 4 years, it's quite different.
They don't say konnichiwa, they say, are you mokarimaka, right? Are you making money? And the people in Tokyo look at them as sort of new money arrivistes in some ways. So there's a very, just between those two geographic locations, there's a big change. But I think we've got a number of very interesting people who may have grown up overseas or may have studied overseas, and not everybody wants the seniority-based system, the Nenko Joretsu, that you have with Japanese companies. So we have people here, and we can recruit people who understand what it's like to work for a foreign firm in Japan. The freedom, the ability to sort of jump the queue in terms of your career, and just the different.
So
it's different. It is self-selecting, very much so. Yes. So.
Is it getting harder to find those people?
It's actually getting easier in some ways, because, again, more and more Japanese had been studying overseas. They're coming back. They're looking for other things. Some of them might want to be returning to Japan. And we have Japanese staff all over the world, Japanese nationals working at some of our offices throughout the world at this point. And they're fantastically cosmopolitan and make great contributions to us.
The reason I ask it is because when you look at the actual numbers of Japanese going overseas to study, it actually took quite a big hit.
Yes.
Came down quite a lot and hasn't sort of come right back up again. And also the nature of their study has gone from sort of 4-year degrees down to much shorter periods of time. So a little bit more shallow immersion going on than before. And part of it also, you probably remember Yanai-san from Uniqlo complaining about, he wants to send the young Japanese overseas to run his operation around the world. They don't want to go, they want to stay here. And this part of the younger generation anyway, not interested in learning English, not interested in speaking English, want to stay here, it's safe, the food's great, it's, Japanese, great, everything good. So I'm just wondering, are we actually going to run into a problem of really severe competition for a limited number of young people who are going to be able to come into our companies? Because once upon a time, the Japanese firms didn't compete in that pool of labour for the talent. But now, a lot of them, because of their, population decline, they're basing their organisation more outside of Japan. They're looking for Japanese to go and work outside. Their competition's going up. So I was intrigued when you said it's getting better. That's interesting.
If you go to the Boston Career Forum, you'll still find a number of young people who want to relocate here to Japan. And yes, the Japanese firms are recruiting there as well, but there's always a queue outside of some of the Wall Street brokers.
Is it easy because you're in the finance business where there's a relatively large chunk of dough is going to come with the appointment?
I'll let the lines speak for themselves. So people vote with their feet. So There was always a queue in front of the consultants and the Wall Street banks.
Is there, I bet
So.
there is too. There's something we haven't covered around leadership that we should have talked about, Dan.
Mm.
Any other topics?
No, I just think it's very simple. It's the ability to project a vision and actualize it. So it sounds simple, but simple but not easy.
Simple but not easy. And if you're going to give a definition of leadership, what would that definition be?
That would be it. It would be the ability to actualize a vision.
Oh, to actualize your vision.
Actualize your vision. But to Yogi Berra's point, yes, leaders need followers. So nobody's going to follow you if they don't think you're going to get them to the high ground.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So Dan, thank you very much. That was great. Really a great pleasure to have a chance to talk to you about leadership in Japan.
Thanks very much for hosting me, Greg. All the best.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
So join us again for our next episode of Japan's top business interviews.